Okay, so the shift away from the Ottoman state being kind of the center of the most advanced and developed societies in the world at that point, at least scientifically and militarily, occurs around the year 1500. But this was also pushed by developments in the Ottoman Empire itself, namely the conquest of Constantinople, which we talked about last time in the year 1452, 1454, somewhere around there. I'd have to look up the exact year also. No, there it is. It's on the slide, 1453. There we go. When the Ottomans conquered Constantinople and basically renamed it and made it their own capital city of their own state, they renamed it Istanbul and conquered the surrounding areas also. This is important not just for the end of the last holdover from the old Roman Empire, but this is important for Europe as a whole. Because when the Ottomans do this, they take control over the major crossing point land-wise from Europe into the Asian markets. The Persian Empire, the old Persian areas around what is today known as Iran. Going further east, you have northern Indian civilization, and going even further east than that, you have Chinese civilization. The Europeans had made it across a series of kind of forts and connections known as the Silk Road or the Spice Road or the Salt Road, depending on which textbook you look in. This road literally stretched from the eastern coast of the Mediterranean right around Constantinople and stretched all the way to China. And that is what Europeans had used to travel back and forth across these different civilizations. And it was a very profitable travel if you could get to India and load up your wagons or whatnot with Indian-made goods like cotton clothing, or if you can make it all the way to China, you probably take in porcelain or silk or something like that. Buy them up a lot in those civilizations where they're common, because if there's a whole lot of something in the market, what does the price do with supply and demand? The price drops when you have a lot of the good, right? It's not rare, so it's pretty cheap to buy. So the Europeans have been traveling into, say, northern Indian civilization or Persian civilization, buying up common goods there at very low prices and bringing them back to Europe where they were rare. So when they sell them in Europe, what happens to the price? Skyrockets. And this was a hugely profitable trade. I mean, you're talking about people getting so rich off of one of these journeys that they never have to work again. They become millionaires overnight, if they can do it. But when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, they don't shut down the road, but they jack up the tax rates on travelers from other civilizations, specifically Europeans, because the Ottomans knew that the Europeans were making a lot of money off this. And most intelligent governments that want to increase their revenue raise taxes on who? The rich. The people who have money, right? If you want to get money quick, you raise taxes on the people who have cash. And that's what the Ottomans started doing. They knew the Europeans were traveling through making a lot of money, so they raised the tax rates, mostly tolls on roads and bridges and stuff like that, because they didn't really have much of an income tax back then the way we think of it today. So the Europeans, much like many wealthy people today, don't really want to pay the tax. And they look for any way they can possibly find to get around the tax. So specifically, Western European countries, Spain and Portugal, start openly advertising amongst Europe for explorers to find some cheaper, quicker, and easier way to get to India without having to go along that road. So immediately some sailors go to, especially Portugal first, because they're the first to advertise this idea. How are you going to accomplish this? The Portuguese government had already been funding explorations around the northern coast of Africa, kind of around the African continent, just north of the Sahara Desert, and a little bit further south, but not very far. The Europeans are somewhat scientifically backward at this point. They haven't developed the big, strong boats yet by the year 1400 to sail in the big oceans, specifically the Atlantic, which is a stormy ocean that tends to break you if you're not prepared. So a lot of European explorers that aren't necessarily from Portugal go to Portugal to have meetings with the royal government of Portugal, the Portuguese king and his advisors, and they pitch ideas about how to get to India faster. Two major different ideas arise. One is from a guy named Cristobal Colon, whose name is mistakenly kind of bastardized down into English form to mean Christopher Columbus. But he is from northern Italy, so he did not think of his name that way. His name was officially Cristobal Colon. He proposes to the Portuguese king, give me some boats and some funding, and so I can get some sailors and some food and fresh water to keep on the boat so we don't die on the boat. And we're going to sail directly west. Because the Europeans, by and large, did not know that these North American or these American continents actually exist. They think it's open ocean. So Colon's idea is he wants to set sail from Portugal, way out here on the tip of Western Europe, set sail directly west, and he figures he's going to run into China or India or something in this area, and he'll get to Asia that way. Colon thinks of himself also as a kind of mathematician and scientist. He thinks that he has a great discovery that will give him an advantage. Other Europeans have thought of this before, and no one's really tried it. According to his projections, the trip is only going to take, I think it was somewhere around 5,000 miles. He did his own projections about the size of the Earth, and the high-level scientists knew that the Earth was round. I mean, that's a kind of grade school myth that a lot of people don't believe. The ignorant Europeans who couldn't even read and write their own name may have believed that it's all flat, fall off the edge or something. But most of these explorers understood the thing was round. I mean, that's well known amongst philosophers since ancient times. But Colon believed that the world is actually smaller than it really is in his mind, and he misjudged it by a good 8,000 miles or so. So he takes his projections to the Portuguese king, and the king doesn't know all that much about science, but he has scientific advisors and mathematicians who listen to Colon's pitch, and the advisors, Colon gives his pitch and walks out, and the advisors have a meeting with the king, and the advisors say, this guy's numbers are off. If you give him boats and crews and enough money to buy fresh water and food, and they set sail, he's only asking for enough food to get so many miles according to his numbers. But the world we know is actually a lot bigger than that. And if he starts sailing out there, he's not going to make it. He's only going to have enough supplies to get so far, and he's going to have to go a lot further to make it to China. So they advise what? Don't give him money. Giving him money would be like burning money, because he's going to set sail. You're never going to hear from him again. They're going to die out there somewhere. And the Portuguese king says, yeah, that's pretty good advice, I think. So they choose not to give Colon funding. So they bring in the next guy with the next idea. His name is Diaz. And he has a different idea about how to get to India. Diaz's idea is to set sail southward from Portugal. And if you, again, go back to the map, the Portuguese had already been exploring the kind of northwestern coast of the African continent, but they don't really know very much about where that land ends. And Diaz has an idea that the land ends somewhere, there's open ocean down there somewhere. So he says, give me funding, and I'll go south, and I'll find the southern tip of this giant landmass and go around it and make it to India and come back and give you guys the secret. Because any government that does this first, traders all over Europe will go to that country, right? Because they have found the secret. And if they're traveling through your country and they're making a lot of money, guess what? You can raise taxes on them, at least probably less than the Ottomans did. And because it's cheaper and faster and easier to just sail around than to walk to India or ride your horse or whatever, whichever government discovers this first stands to make a huge amount of money. So Diaz gives his sales pitch to the same advisors. The advisors tell the king, this one sounds a little bit more reasonable. So they decide to give funding to Diaz. And Diaz goes off on his explorations, and he does. He goes down the, at least northern part, thinks that that's actually the southern tip, and so he turned eastward and probably were very shocked and frustrated that the land began again. So they basically follow the coastline all the way down to eventually what they realize is the southern end of Africa. And at that point, Diaz says, all right, we finally found the thing. Now we're going to basically follow the land upward and try to make our way to India. But this has taken a while. This has been a year of sailing just to get to the southern tip. And his sailors are worried. They feel that they're running out of food, they're running out of supplies, and they're kind of leery about Diaz's leadership. So they try to convince him to turn back and go home. That they found what they were looking for. Let's head home, spread the news, and we'll get better supplies to finish the voyage next time. Diaz wants to keep going until the crew threatens to mutiny and probably kill him, and then turn back and go home. So he sees it as his choice. I can either stick with my guns and probably die trying to get to India, or I can turn around and go back home. So he chooses to live. They go back to Portugal, spread the news. Diaz is a great hero, and the Portuguese government starts giving increased funding to launch more explorations around Africa. Eventually they do make it to India and back, so they have discovered what they think is the great secret. But that's not the end of the story. Colon is angry and frustrated, so he takes his sales pitch and his exact same idea to the newly created unified Spanish government in the year 1492, which is an important year for Spanish history. This part of Europe, the so-called Iberian Peninsula, had been conquered by Muslim armies way, way back in the 700s. And the kind of indigenous Europeans of this area had tried to kick the Muslims out time and time again for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was a slow-moving process. And it is finally finished in 1492. The kind of unified Spanish government finally kicked the last Muslim military pieces out of the southern area of Granada back across into North Africa. So Spain is now unified. They have control over their territory, but they've been fighting this war for hundreds of years, and they've had high taxes because of the war. You have to pay for it somehow, right? But now the war is over. They still have the high taxes, though, so the revenue is still coming in, but they're not spending it. So when Colon happens to arrive in the Spanish capital, has an audience with the king and the queen and their advisors, same sales pitch, same numbers, same everything, and the advisors say what?
Go for it.
Most of them say no. Because, again, you give him money, he's going to go out there and die, it's a waste. Don't do it. But there is one very astute and possibly very cutthroat advisor who says, look, the Portuguese are already doing this. They stand to profit off it hugely. You have extra money that the government is not using. So why not take a piece of that extra money, give it to this guy. Yes, he probably is going to go out in the ocean and die somewhere. And it probably will be a waste of your money, but it's no money you're not using, so whatever. It's not really a big risk to you. You're not going to take a big hit. But if he's right, Spain stands to launch into global power and wealth and prosperity. So this advisor says, yes, it's a very risky investment, and yes, you're probably going to lose. But that small chance that he's right will make it worth the risk. Does that make sense? Some questions about any of that? They give him funding. He sets out in August of 1492. First sails a little bit south to the Canary Islands, which was a kind of Spanish colony. So he resupplies there and loads up and turns west into the open ocean. Travels for 2 months. They finally sight land. Somewhere, we believe, in one of the Caribbean islands. A lot of historians tend to believe, or they argue, according to evidence we have, that he landed on the Cuban island somehow, somewhere. What is today Cuba? There's some other theories about maybe this other island that is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, that they called Hispaniola. But he lands somewhere out there. But again, he didn't know, and most Europeans didn't know, that these two giant landmasses exist. These Americas are in existence. So he lands on this island, runs into darker-skinned peoples that speak a strange language. He knows enough about Chinese and Japanese people to know that they're not Chinese or Japanese. So who does he think they are?
People from India.
He thinks that he has landed somewhere on an island off of India, and he calls them Indians, which is a pathetic mistake. But it's one that a lot of people still insist on making today by calling what should be called Native Americans into Indians. based on his mistaken geography. And he never admits it. For the rest of his life, he believes that he's landed somewhere off of India, even though he brings some plants on board, even takes some of the natives onto his boat, sails back to Spain, says, looky what I found. I was right, everyone else is wrong. But the Spanish advisors say, well, you're not really in India. You've discovered a new place we haven't known about yet. But he never buys it. He always insists for the rest of his life that he found the secret route to India. So he thinks that he's landed somewhere on one of these islands that we today identify at the southeast coast of Asia. What the European colonists will call the East Indies, because that term just goes into the kind of discussion. And the Caribbean islands, over time, according to the European colonists, become known as the West Indies, even though they're nowhere close to India. But that's the mistake, and that's what happens sometimes with language. When people get used to just calling something a certain term, they don't know the background of it, they can keep going mistakenly calling it that. Does anyone know why they called the Americas the Americas? Yeah.
It was named after
Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian explorer. And when he came back, they started calling it the land that America discovered, and it just got bastardized down to the Americas. I mean, history's funny like that. It happens. Yeah.
I always wondered why they didn't call it Vespucci land or something like that.
Who knows? But that's the general story. Columbus goes back and forth a couple times in the 1490s. Columbus's great ambition, or Colon's great ambition, is to really set up the areas he discovered as his own personal fiefdom, his own personal kind of monopoly. He wanted to set up a government there that would run all the trade in the area so that he could profit off it personally. Of course, he wanted a monopoly with himself as the CEO. So he wanted to make himself rich off it. The Spanish government disagrees with that, and he constantly has to go back and forth between these areas in Spain and try to kind of keep control over what he views to be his somehow. Well, it doesn't work out for him, and eventually he gets into enslaving the natives and doing some really horrible things, and he's eventually even thrown in jail in Spain for all the brutality inflicted upon these native people. He's finally let out for one last voyage, and he dies out there. So that's his story. But immediately after Colon returned to Spain and announced this, a lot of other European explorers just start launching expeditions, one after another, to discover, what has he actually found, and just try to start drawing the map of where this land is. I mean, they discover some coastlines, but they don't know where the land ends. They don't know where any rivers are or anything. So there are decades and decades of explorations. And if you ever take a look at some European maps of this area drawn in even the late 1500s, they're not very accurate. Because they're constantly having to fill in the blank spots. And it goes on for a long, long time. All right, moving forward. One of the major problems was the Portuguese and other European governments realized that this is a big moneymaker. So especially the Portuguese start also exploring around the Atlantic. And when you have competition from two different countries, basically employees of two different countries going off and sailing in the open ocean, they start running into each other. They don't treat each other very nicely. They don't play nice. They attack each other. They kill each other. So this is really kind of the wild, wild west out on the open ocean. And there's so much violence out there that eventually the Spanish and the Portuguese government say, we need to make some kind of decision about who gets what, so we can have some kind of stability and we don't lose money on burning boats and whatnot. So they try to find a neutral decision maker who didn't have one vested interest in one country or another to, make a declaration. So they hit on the Pope. Both monarchies are very devoted to the Pope's religion, the Pope's church. So the Pope breaks out a map and says, okay, the Spanish have been mostly exploring around what we today call the Caribbean, and the Portuguese historically have explored mostly Africa. So he takes a line and draws it right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, without knowing where the land is or anything. So eventually he draws a line that cuts off a tiny piece of what we today call South America, and Portugal gets everything to the east, Spain gets everything to the west. And who do you think won out in this land deal? Spain, without a doubt, because they didn't know the extent of these territories. They didn't even know that eventually, or right off the bat, this little piece is going to stick off. So the only colony that Portugal really gets in what they call the whole New World, the Western Hemisphere, is right here along this coastline of this little chunk of South America. They establish a colony that they call, eventually, Brazil. And right down to this day, I believe, Brazil is the only country in the Americas that is mostly Portuguese language. See? These things happen with language. Most of the rest is some derivative or another of Spanish, because the Spanish went into control. Okay, and the Spanish exert their control. The Spanish, they start sending explorers. The explorers at first just want to find better routes to Asia, but they quickly realize, or not quickly, but they understand eventually that it's not easy to get to Asia around the Americas because the Americas are so large. They constantly look for rivers or something that will bring them from the Atlantic to the Pacific side. Eventually, it's not easy. You either have to go all the way up to the Arctic Ocean, which is difficult because it freezes, and you can die of freezing or starvation or something, or you have to go around the southern tip of South America, which is one of the stormiest places on the seas in the entire globe. Hugely dangerous. So quickly, especially the Spanish explorers turned from trying to get to India to make money to finding native groups somewhere in all this land that have something that the Spanish want, and the Spanish want gold. They hear rumors about extraordinarily wealthy interior tribes, native tribes, and these so-called cities of gold, where the cities are literally made out of gold, and that just makes the Spanish drool. Because the explorers know that if you can find this city of gold, and you could literally just start taking bricks off a building and load up your boat with gold, you go back home with all this gold, and you're rich forever, right? You'll never be able to spend that much money in your whole life. So the greed for gold leads the Spanish to launch brutal invasions of native territory, especially the Aztec Empire, conquered by Cortez, and a few hundred of Spanish kind of imperial soldiers. And they launch another invasion under another leadership, under Pizarro, of the Incan Empire. And they conquer those two large and probably the most powerful internal native tribes within just a few years. Reduce a whole lot of that population to slavery and force them into the gold and silver mines, especially the Incan Empire. So the conquest and the occupation and exploitation of those people is brutal beyond almost anything else in human experience. So questions about that at all? No. Okay, moving forward. The result of these conquests in particular is that Spain starts sucking the gold out of the New World as much as they possibly can, and they're hugely enriched. Their businesses are enriched. The government gains tax revenue from those businesses. So the Spanish government, through this stuff alone, launches to the heights of world power. Spain is the predominant military, economic, and political power in Europe for a century, for 100 years, off of this. And it's estimated that the King of Spain was probably the most powerful person on the planet at that point. He did a lot of things. What do governments often do with the increase in money that they get?
They hire more people.
They hire more people, particularly soldiers. So the Spanish government launches into a building program of more weapons, more boats, hire more soldiers, and they literally push the other European countries around militarily for a long, long time. Spain will not stay a dominant European and world power for very long. I mean, in the whole kind of context of our class of 100 years, give or take, Spain's only the predominant power, overwhelmingly for 50 years, but then it starts to decline in the 1570s, thereabout, for several reasons. Number one, the very fact that they're trying to conquer and control these two huge land masses, when you compare the size of Spain to the Americas, is going to be very difficult. They don't have enough people. No matter how many boats they build, they don't have enough resources to control those two entire areas. It is just too much. And that's what we historians, military historians, call strategic overstretch. You have stretched your resources too thin, therefore any one little place is an easy target for attack. So their economic expansion is mostly focused on military expansion. We'll get into the Reformation politics and how the Spanish get involved in that and start spending money not just on conquering and controlling the New World, but also trying to conquer and control huge parts of Europe, which becomes even more expensive for them. So the Reformation we'll get into after the break. That's another lecture. Another major problem is when you flood your own internal economy with a huge amount of new money, what happens? Inflation. That individual piece of money is worth less and less. You can't buy as much with it. And that exact thing starts happening to the Spanish Empire. They bring out too much gold too quickly and they don't control it. The government doesn't try to control it very effectively. So inflation becomes epidemic in Spain for the long term. And because they hadn't really began studying economics as a kind of science, trying to figure out how this stuff is happening, they didn't know what to do about it. I mean, the Roman Empire is broken by largely the same thing. Inflation. That was one of the big economic factors in the fall of Rome. So, 1,000 years later, they still didn't know how to solve the problem. So by about the 1560s, 1570s, yes, Spain is the most powerful country in the world and definitely in Europe. But in the 70s, it starts to fall because all these things start combining to kind of drag it down. And by the 1600s, it's not the most powerful country anymore. Okay. The first guy who really inherits the Spanish throne right at the point where they are conquering the Aztec and then they'll go off and conquer the Inca. So the guy who really benefits as a government leader of Spain is the Emperor Charles V. He was not just king of Spain. He inherited land from all four of his grandparents had some kind of holding in Europe. So I think it was from his father's side, he got Spain, and a huge amount of on his paternal grandfather's side got Spain, and I believe areas around what we today call the Netherlands, Holland, Belgium, those kinds of places. And from his mother's side, he was attached to the Austrian Empire, which is in Eastern Europe. So he also became king of Austria at the same time. And from, I think it's his mother's father's side, he got pieces in northern Italy. So at the same time, he inherits all these different chunks of Europe. And there's a real possibility, because Spain is making so much money, that he's going to conquer the rest of Europe. So the rest of the European countries are very afraid of this guy. Like England, France. They're afraid he's literally going to try to conquer the whole continent and make himself emperor of all of Europe. And it seems possible because he has enough money to do it, apparently. And he does get involved in a lot of European wars, and that really drags him down. As the Spanish Empire is undergoing this inflation, they don't have enough tax revenue to pay for the wars and all the things they're doing. So what do governments do when they don't have enough money to pay their bills? Oh, they can raise taxes. That's unpopular in Spain, so that's kind of a non-starter. That's not going to go very far. What else do? They mint. They what?
Mint.
Well, they make money, but Spain's already churning out as much money as they can with all the gold. What else do?
Borrow.
They borrow. They go into debt. They start taking on what we think of today as national debts. And the Spanish government starts doing this to get quick cash. Basically, they take on money from investors and promise to pay it back over 10 years or 20 years or whatever the term of the loan is, with interest rates attached. The big loan that Charles V was willing to give, because the investors said, well, your economy is kind of teetering, so we don't trust you very much, so how are you going to pay us back? He started giving out what came to be known as the asiento loans, which means the next treasure boat that comes back from the New World laden with gold, when it arrives in Spain, the investors will be paid out of that. Does that make sense? So if you're an investor, you give the Spanish monarchy, say, $1,000, and the promise is when the next treasure fleet comes in, you're going to get $1,200 back. Make sense? So you make profit off it as long as what? As long as the boats come in. And that was a major problem, because not only can they not keep control over the New World colonies very effectively, but they can't control the Atlantic Ocean either. It's too big. So as these treasure boats are coming back across the wild, wild west of the time, they're like very slow-moving fat ducks going across the open ocean. And they get attacked. Not just by Portuguese people or French people that want to sink the boat to hurt this guy, but by who else? Pirates. Thieves. These are like the slow-moving, defenseless vans full of gold driving down the freeway. If they don't have a lot of guns and protection, they get attacked by people who want the money for themselves. And this is where you start getting this idea of the Pirates of the Caribbean, who they attack Spanish boats out here, kill the prisoners, burn the boat, destroy the evidence, and then run off with the gold and hide it in one of these, hard-to-find islands, or they bury it or something like that. What do you think Charles thought of this?
Wasn't a fan.
Yeah, he wasn't a fan of it. In fact, he's pretty pissed off about it. So he starts launching wars against pirates and trying to eradicate them. But other countries start paying pirates to do this. Why? Because they want to kneecap his power. They want to take him out. They can't attack him directly. He's too strong. So they attack him in his most vulnerable place, which is to pay pirates to knock out the treasure fleets. If he can't get the treasure fleets coming in, he can't get loans. Therefore, his government may collapse. That's the theory. So the asiento loans are famous, not as a source of great power for Spain, but as a great weakness. And the other government leaders understood that weakness, and they went after it. This was the soft target of the time. To the point where when Charles V, instead of waiting to pass off his power to the next generation by dying, he chose to retire and signed a deal with a lot of other European countries that they would stop attacking the Spanish government if he agreed to only give Spain to one guy and then break off another part of his family and give Austria to some other parts of the family. Basically so that the empire that Charles ruled would be split up, so it wouldn't be able to come together again and try to reconquer the whole continent, which made people like the English and the French, and especially the Dutch and a lot of different Germans happy, because they didn't have to be so fearful anymore. So Charles V goes into retirement in 1556. This allows the next generation to come forward. In Spain, that is going to be Philip II. Still probably the most powerful of the European monarchs, because he declares bankruptcy almost immediately, which means he's not going to pay back the loans and all the interest that previous government had signed on for. So bankruptcy is his tactic to kind of wipe the slate clean and start over again. But he starts getting involved in the same exact kind of problems that Charles did, so it's not really much of a solution in the long run. But he is still probably the most powerful European monarch in his lifetime. And a lot of historians argue without doubt the most powerful European monarch. Has the most money and has the biggest military. He also theoretically inherited the Netherlands. They called it at the time the Spanish Netherlands. And I hope I have a map in here somewhere. Yeah. Spanish Netherlands are up here in kind of northern Germany as it starts to get connected to France. So that was a part of the Spanish Empire. So the King of Spain is down here and is still claiming to ownership to land up there. When he declares bankruptcy, eventually he cannot pay his army in the Netherlands for a few months. And what usually happens when you stop paying your soldiers? They mutiny. They don't like that very much. They want their money. So a revolt breaks out, first in the army and then spreads to the general population because the people in the Netherlands want to go in for Protestantism under the Reformation. We'll get to that later. But they have a religious disagreement. They don't want to be a part of the Pope's church anymore. But the King of Spain is a very close friend of the Pope. So a revolt breaks out, basically an insurgency against the King of Spain in the Netherlands, and he has to pour money into it to try to keep control. Eventually it doesn't work. He's going to have to give up. But that's a source of major problems for the rest of his rule. And then England starts getting involved. England wants to rise as a power, so they specifically start doing a lot of things in the world that the Spanish king doesn't like. You don't have to write down the details of this chart. This is the family relations between the English/British rulers and the Spanish rulers. When King Philip II came to the throne, he was married to the eldest daughter of the former English king, Henry VIII. So his eldest daughter is Mary I. She becomes Queen of England when Henry's only son dies at, I think, around age 16 or 17. He's a pretty sick kid. He doesn't make it. So she becomes queen, but she's married to the King of Spain. So what does this guy become? King of England. He stays in Spain. He travels to England every once in a while, basically trying to impregnate her so they can unify the English and Spanish monarchies. But they're married, and she gets cancer fairly quickly and dies, so she doesn't have any kids. Therefore, the English throne goes to the next sibling in line, younger sister Elizabeth. Does that make sense? Very quickly, I mean within weeks, I believe. I'd have to look that up, but it's very fast. Philip writes a letter to Elizabeth saying, "I've heard how beautiful you are, and I would like to marry you too." Which Elizabeth thought was weird. This would be like your brother-in-law asking to marry you when your sister dies. That's exactly what it is. Why? Because he still wants to be King of England. She doesn't like him, doesn't trust him, and she's a power politician herself. She's a political genius, basically. And she wants to keep power for herself, so she will never get married, not to anybody, and never has children. She wants to be queen. She wants to be the one in control. And she knows if she gets married, the man she marries is going to be king, and she'll just kind of be pushed aside. Does that make sense? Questions about any of this convoluted stuff? But this is common for Europe of the time. These royal families intermarried with each other all the time. And that's why a lot of their kids died fairly young, because the gene pool starts getting pretty restricted. And they start getting these a lot of diseases and physical problems in a lot of ways for a lot of European monarchs. But this is pretty common. This is even a very simplified map of these two families. And it just gets a lot stranger going forward. But Elizabeth and Philip don't like each other. And Elizabeth views Philip as an enemy and starts taking steps to, well, there's images of them too. Elizabeth wants to knock Spain out as a potential enemy. So Elizabeth's government starts taking actions against Spanish power in the world in a lot of different ways. She starts giving money to the Dutch rebels. And this is one of the first times we'll see what we call geopolitics coming into play. Does anyone know what that term means? Yeah, it's the politics of geography. The basic theory is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Or the enemy of my enemy, is my friend. Which means, if I don't like you, I will pick out anybody that you are fighting against and help them. Why is that? To keep them fighting to hurt you in any way possible. The best way I have to explain this in some kind of real world way that first time history students can understand is, I'm a big baseball fan. I like the Tampa Bay team for reasons we don't have to get into. I used to be an Angels fan, and then they started spending money stupidly, and no, not going to root for them anymore. And I specifically root for the poorer teams. I like underdogs that are fun. So I'm a big Tampa fan. I want Tampa to win their division and get to the playoffs every year. Who stands in Tampa's way? Boston. New York Yankees. The evil scourge of the world, or at least of the baseball world. So in all instances, I root against the Red Sox, I root against the Yankees. So when the Yankees go to Texas, and the Yankees go to Seattle, and the Yankees go to Minnesota, who do I root for? Texas, Seattle, Minnesota. Do I care about Seattle or Minnesota? No. Why do I root for them? Because they can hurt my great enemy, or my team's great enemy, put it that way. Does that make sense? That's geopolitics. And we're going to see that pop up again and again and again throughout this semester. And it's happening today in a lot of very clear ways. So that's what Elizabeth is doing. She's sending money and help to the Dutch rebellion in order to hurt Spain. She hires pirates and gives them English government funding to attack the Spanish treasure fleets in the Atlantic. She doesn't want to call them pirates because that's kind of controversial, because piracy is illegal. So she calls them privateers. They are privatized pirates. That's what that means. So she continues doing this into the 1570s, gives them even more money, and at this point the Spanish king understands what's going on. It's not very secret. It's in fact kind of a joke in Europe. So the Spanish king is getting increasingly pissed off, and he continues saying, if Elizabeth keeps doing this, we're going to attack England and just take her out, destroy her government, and decide what to do with England afterward. And if you've ever seen the Elizabeth movies, the one with Kate Blanchett, the second one has everything to do with this. That's what this is about. Or this is what that's about. That way. It makes more sense. The final straw was when Elizabeth gives funding to a guy named Francis Drake, which is known to be one of her number one pirate employees. And Drake launches a series of raids he goes down to the tip of South America, gets around it. It was pretty well known where that was and how to get around it by that point. But there's a line of Spanish colonies up the western coast of South America because they had conquered the Incan Empire, right? And going up, what we today think of as Central America, up into present-day Mexico, there's a line of Spanish forts in Spanish control. So Drake's plan is to attack those and burn them and take whatever of value he could possibly, that wasn't nailed down to the floor, basically. So he attacks the first one, successful, takes on some wealth and some boats, burns the place. Probably would have been smart to turn back and go back home. Easiest escape route. But he doesn't. He keeps going north and attacks the next place. And keeps going north and attacks the next place. And he starts going up the coast of South America. The places he attacked, the survivors got on boats and traveled, sent messages back to Spain, letting the government know what's going on. So the Spanish government starts sending a large navy after Drake, and they start traveling up the coast behind Drake. So Drake now has a massive conundrum. He can't turn south and try to make it back across around the southern tip and go back because he's going to get caught. He keeps going north, attacking one place after another, but he can't keep going north, right? Because he knows it's going to start getting cold up there, and that's not much of an escape plan. He doesn't want to land and go inland because he doesn't know what's in there. So he figures eventually that his best escape route is to take the risk, turn west, and sail off into the open ocean. No one had ever done this before in European history. No one knew how far it was. No one knew what was out there. So he figures it's better to turn west and possibly die out there in the ocean rather than get caught by the Spanish, because he's definitely going to die if they catch him. The Spanish king has an order of execution. And basically they're going to take him back to Spain, put him on some kind of kangaroo court trial, and cut his head off the next day or something. So he turns west and eventually makes it all the way down into the southeastern islands, and they're very happy to see land at that point. Very few of Drake's original crew actually survived this long thing. But once they land in these islands, they generally know where they are. They know where India is, so they go back around the southern tip of Africa, make it all the way back to England. This is a long voyage. It takes over 2 years, very nearly 3 years. When Drake gets back to England, everyone gave him up for dead. No one thought that he was coming back. So he's a celebrated figure in England. People buy him drinks. All of Europe hears about this. This is a famous thing because he becomes known as one of the first people to go all the way around and make it back alive. So it's big news in Europe. The Spanish king hears about it, and he's not too happy. He sends a message to Elizabeth, turn this pirate over to be tried and held for justice in Spain. What does Elizabeth do? She doesn't turn him over. What does she do with him?
She sends him out?
Nope. She makes him a knight in England, which is one of the highest honors you can give, which is really a giant slap in the face to the Spanish king, and he basically declares war that instant. So, the Spanish king's policy is now to conquer England. He's had it with Elizabeth. He is aiming to conquer the country, kill Elizabeth's government, and replace it with something that will follow orders from the King of Spain. The rumors are that he's going to appoint his daughter to be Queen of England. His Spanish daughter. So you can imagine what the English think of that. They're not very enthused. And he starts building up a massive navy to do this. This massive navy is built in a few different places, but largely here in the northwestern corner of Spain. It becomes known as the Spanish Armada because it is basically one of the biggest navies ever assembled up to that point in human history that we know of. They spend years building this thing. They spend every dime they could get a hold of to build this thing. Thousands of ships. They buy up any boat in Spain that can possibly float, and they start putting cannons on them. This is a giant thing, and somehow the Spanish government thought they were going to keep it secret. They basically dedicate a couple entire cities to building this thing, and somehow they don't think that spies are going to find out about it. The English spies find out pretty quickly. And even though it's supposed to be a secret, it's known throughout Europe as the worst kept secret in Europe. Everybody knows that this is going to happen. So everybody's watching. The English know about it, and they start building up their defenses. The English figure out how to build. They don't have enough boats to go up toe-to-toe against this armada, firepower against firepower. So they build smaller boats that move much faster. And they eventually design cannon that shoot further. So when this thing attacks, basically they will be kind of swarmed and harassed by English boats following at a distance short enough for the English to hit the Spanish with cannon fire, but not far enough for the Spanish to fire back. Does that make sense? Because the Spanish cannons just weren't as advanced. So they went in for size, not quality. The Spanish did. The English went in for quality and not so much size. The plan for invasion is very, very complex. They come up with a minute-by-minute timetable for how this invasion is supposed to go, which if you've ever studied military history or taken part in any kind of military types of operations, things get screwed up. Things never run according to perfect plan, right? So the very fact they created this very intricate plan, that I'll give you the simplification of in a second, was a major kind of practical mistake that the government made. The plan is basically to take the Armada, sail into what's known as the English Channel, this waterway between England and mainland Europe, sail into the English Channel, destroy the English Navy in the Channel, and once the English Navy is destroyed, land here at Dunkirk in the Netherlands, where the Spanish already have a gigantic army because they're fighting against the Dutch rebels, right? So there's already a Spanish army there. They figure they'll pick up the army, and once you knock the English Navy out of the area, the English army is tiny. So once this army from Dunkirk lands just outside London, no contest. The Spanish are going to win. So the English put everything they have into preventing the Armada's ability to land on schedule and pick up that army. And again, these are the two guys in charge of the whole succor. The Duke of Parma is the army leader sitting at Dunkirk waiting to be picked up on a very specific day and time. And the Duke of Medina Sidonia is the leader of the navy. Bad choice for being a leader of your navy. This guy was an army general who knew how to use a land army, but had largely never been on a boat before and got seasick on the way. And he appears to have panicked because the timeline, once it gets a little bit off, he starts trying to go too fast to catch up. And eventually he arrives a few days early before Parma is scheduled to get on the boats, get his army on the boats. So Medina Sidonia, his leadership is a disaster in almost every way. And the English take advantage of that. So the thing leaves, goes up into the English Channel, constantly harassed. There's a few small battles in the English Channel, but the English Navy stays at an arm's distance. And they just pummel the Spanish Armada as it moves through the Channel very slowly. Obviously, it's a huge movement. And here's a map of a few of the battles. This is basically the English Navy just pummeling the Spanish Armada as it travels very slowly, very predictably. Eventually, Medina Sidonia decides that they have to take shelter. They have to seek a good port. So they go to the French town on this coastline of Calais. And because the Armada is so large and this port is not big enough to really house all the boats of the Armada, they have to pack all the boats in very tight into the port in order to try to squeeze them all in, right? Which turns out to be a big mistake, because that presents a great opportunity for the English to do what? To attack, but attack in a very specific way. What's the easiest way to destroy wooden boats? Burn them. So the English take a few of their own boats that move pretty fast, set them on fire, and then launch them into the port to slam into the Spanish boats and set the Spanish boats on fire. Because they're all packed in like sardines, they can't really maneuver and get out of the way, and they can't escape. So a huge part of the Spanish Armada burns in port at this on this night. The ones that escape fight another battle. Is it on here? No, it's on this map. Here we go. So when they escape, they bypass Dunkirk, and there's a giant battle at this place that becomes known as the Battle of Gravelines, just north of Dunkirk in the sea, in the ocean. And this is the battle where the English force the Spanish Armada away from the continent so that they can never pick up Parma's army sitting in Holland. And the Spanish Armada is forced northward, also through a series of there's a series of storms also that hurt the Armada. So everything was against the Armada at this point. And this map shows the eventual route. They are pushed away from Dunkirk, and eventually they flee back home by the only way open to them, really, is to sail around the northern tip of this Scotland and then the islands of Ireland. Lots of shipwrecks as they hit more storms, and then they limped back down into France and Spain. So the Armada is a giant epidemic failure. Elizabeth's government survives, and the Armada is historically the high point of Spanish power, the Spanish Empire's power. This was the last time that the Spanish king will threaten other European governments to that level. So once they return home, the Spanish king threatens to build another armada in a couple years and try the whole thing again, learn from their mistakes. But he gets involved in other European politics and has to spend money doing other things, so there is no second armada ever built. And he dies a few years later. So questions about the Armada at all? Okay, so now we're up to around the year 1590. So we've gone through the 1500s in about an hour, the Spanish Empire's history. There's a lot of arguments about the long-term importance of the New World discoveries for Europe, not just in empowering Spain and setting up that whole course of events, but even longer term than that. One of the biggest ones is, of course, in the 1500s, it does empower Spain. Spain rises to the heights of power and then falls by about the year 1600. They are on the decline to the point where in the late 1800s, they will be kind of an easy target for countries that want to conquer their colonies, their few remaining colonies they have. And we'll get there eventually, too, in this class, in this semester. So that's number one. Number two, the creation of these New World empires and the European explorations in general bring together what we can now start calling world history. Up to this point, around the year 1500 or so, the regions of the world, the different civilizations, were pretty isolated from each other. So that things that happened in China tended to stay in China. The importance of that, the impact of those events in China didn't really spread very much. Maybe to Korea or Japan or something through conquest. But a political event in the Chinese capital didn't really have much effect in, say, Spain or England or North America. When the Europeans start exploring and then conquering these vast regions of the world, they start off a process of bringing these regions together to the point where they're very intertwined right down to today, where events in India will have a big impact on economics in London, because there are companies based in London that have business in India, and we'll see their profits hurt by certain things happening in India. To the point today where when you have a financial crash in one part of New York City in 2008, in just a few days, you immediately get mass unemployment in Western China or in northeastern India. So the impact is now extreme. And the world regions are so intertwined that you can see the impact within days, even within hours in some instances. So this is the kind of unification of what we can now start calling world history. Another one, especially for the Europeans themselves, European feudalism was having problems. Their economic and social system that was based in land ownership, basically by about the year 1500, European economic growth was slowing because all the land was owned. There is a very small restricted market for buying new land in Europe. It was all claimed. So right when the European economic system is failing because of the lack of land, they run into these gigantic two new continents that have just unthinkably large land masses that seem to be almost unending amounts of land. And of course the Europeans think they're superior than most of the other world races, so they view this American land as uninhabited, free land for the taking, even though of course it is inhabited by natives. But the Europeans won't really care very much about the natives or their needs going forward. So this is a giant economic boon to Europe itself. An economist, or an early kind of economic thinker named Adam Smith in 1776 wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. It's probably one of the most important books on economics, business, government in all of human history. And in that book he argued, in one section of that book, he argued that the real importance of the New World Conquest was not so much sucking the gold out and enriching Spain, or even being a new place for colonization for European feudal systems, but instead that the discoveries kicked off the development of what Smith called the division of labor. Does that sound familiar? You guys have studied the division of labor at all? Where workers become more efficient by bringing them together, giving them one small task to do, and creating the early kind of factory system, what we would think of as the assembly line kind of production style, which has created everything that you're touching right now physically. Your clothes, your desk, the carpet, tables, everything in here is made in a factory, right? Smith identified the New World discoveries as the first step in that, because the Europeans discovered these huge new populations throughout the world. So if the European businesses want to make enough clothes to sell to the rest of the world, they have to start making things faster, right? So this starts off their inventiveness in making more efficient, more productive, eventually creates factories. So that's Smith's argument going into the future. And of course, this sets off the race for political dominance, mostly through colonization and wars over resources. Starts in the 1500s. We've talked a little bit about the wars between England and Spain, the fight for resources and market dominance in valuable areas. And it only grows from there. When Spain falls, Austria and France rise in the 1600s. When they fall, Britain will rise in the 1700s. They stay dominant until the late 1800s when the Germans rise. And all the Europeans destroy each other basically in the early 1900s in World War I. And then the United States and the Soviet Union rise. And the US and the Soviet Union fight it out until the end of the 1900s. So you can view a lot of this semester as one race for dominance and control over resources that is still ongoing today. It's just one country after another has been dominant, has risen and fallen for different reasons. Often similar reasons. So questions about any of this stuff? I know it's pretty theoretical, but good stuff. So this is the kind of stuff that historians do. They try to identify the long-term trends, the long-term impacts, if you're interested in ever studying history and going forward. So we have all this down. No questions at all? Perfect clarity. I'm better at this job than I ever thought I would be. So. All right. Why does Spain collapse? We've seen these problems before. Number one, historians call it the price revolution. You can call it inflation. Uncontrollable inflation that killed their internal economy. Number two, they started getting attacked by the smaller powers who started ganging up on the big power, the big kid on the block, just as happens right down to today. The secondary powers feel threatened, or they're greedy enough to want to take down number one and try to rise themselves. So they kind of nip at the heels of the big power. And historians call this the Battle of the Atlantic, largely between England and Spain. And the Spanish eventually lose it by losing the wars that the Spanish Armada fought, the battles, the invasion attempts. And when Spain clearly loses the Battle of the Atlantic, a battle to dominate the Atlantic trade and to completely control the New World colonies, the English, the French, the Dutch start getting involved in colonization also in the New World. The Spanish already have control of what, in the short term, are the most valuable areas, the Aztec and Incan empires, because of the gold. So the English, the French, and the Dutch, they start exploring and colonizing other places, namely places around North America, what is known as today as the original 13 colonies of the United States that eventually create the United States, and Canada. So that's where the English, the French, and the Dutch go. And they start fighting it out amongst themselves for dominance over those areas. So those three things together, the internal economic problems, the external attacks, and then the entrance of new challengers in colonization, all combine to sap and eventually destroy Spain as a great power, as the great power, by about the year 1600, and it's a long decline from there on out. So questions for any of that? Nope, you guys are alive, right? I see people moving, so you must be alive. Okay, and with that, we'll take a break. We'll come back at 8:30. Lecture questions for the first one, right here in the folder.